to my computer. All right, well, let me start with introducing Liz Ricci. She's an environmental engineer at the New York State Environmental Facilities Corporation, where she manages the Western Project section. Liz is a licensed professional engineer in New York and has 18 years of experience in the water and wastewater field. In her spare time, she's a volunteer naturalist at the Albany Pine Bush and is working towards becoming a New York master naturalist. Okay, and then we also have Máire Cunningham here. She's the director of the program management at the New York State Environmental Facilities Corporation. So Máire manages the Clean Water State Revolving Fund Program, and that includes federal reporting and the development of the intended use plan. I think all of these have acronyms, but I didn't find the acronyms any more helpful. So I'm struggling through some of these names. Máire also oversees several functions related to the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund Program, as well as the State Water Infrastructure Improvement and the Intermunicipal Grant Programs and the Community Assistance Teams Initiative. And Máire has a BA from the College of St. Rose and a master's from SUNY Albany. So with that, I'm going to let you start to share your screen, and the chat should be available if anybody wants to ask questions via that, and we'll go over them all towards the end. So thanks so much, Liz.
You're welcome. Please let me know if you can see the right screen here. Let me just expand this out. All right. Does that look good to everyone? Can I just confirm that everyone can see the screen okay?
Yep, looks good, Liz.
All right, perfect. All right, so thank you so much for having us. Máire and I are going to jointly give this presentation. As I mentioned, this is the first time we've done something like this, but we're really excited to be invited. I'm a local to the area. I live in Niskayuna, and I started my career as a consultant engineer for about 7 years before transitioning to the state. So I've kind of had a good perspective of working with municipalities on different drinking water and wastewater projects. At the state now, I work predominantly on wastewater, but it was kind of fun to get back into the learning a little bit more about water, and hopefully this presentation will give a pretty good broad overview of water and wastewater. It's kind of hard to know like how much detail to go into a lot of this, so I'm looking forward to what questions that you have and happy to expand out where people have questions. So to give a little bit of background, I'm actually going to let Máire go through these first 2 slides just to learn a little bit more about our agency, and then I'll go right into some of the nitty-gritty water and wastewater topics.
All right, thanks, Liz. And I'll keep this short because Liz has all of the very interesting slides. So, but we wanted to let you know who EFC is, who we are. So we're a public benefit corporation, and we provide low-cost financing and grants to communities across the state to help them fund their water and sewer infrastructure projects. So the thing that we're the most prideful in is that we're able to provide this assistance to communities so that they can fund this infrastructure at, a rate that is low cost and affordable for ratepayers. So everybody who lives and uses these systems, we're able to help fund these upgrades that are really necessary. And you'll see, we'll talk more about the needs and why this is so important at a rate that's really affordable. And we work really closely with a lot of other state agencies, including the Department of Environmental Conservation and the Department of Health. So they help us run both of our state revolving fund programs, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So what is the State Revolving Fund Program? This is a diagram that explains our largest funding bucket, which is federal funding and a mix of state dollars, but it's really what we use to fund infrastructure across the state. So state revolving fund programs are both for water and sewer projects. There's a couple of different mechanisms for where we get this funding. The largest pocket of funding is from the federal government, from the Environmental Protection Agency, in the form of annual allotments called capitalization grants. The state then matches a percentage of that with state funding so that we can use this funding to pay for these projects. In addition to the money that we get from the federal government and state match, we also have funds that come in from our bond proceeds and our repayments from the loans that we have with communities. So the purpose of the revolving fund is so that it revolves over time. That's why it's called a revolving fund. So we are mandated by the federal government to ensure that this program, if the federal government were to cut off funding, so if we didn't get annual allotments anymore, we would still be able to provide this funding to communities in our state without them feeling any kind of impact. So we do that by having what's referred to as a leveraged program, which basically means that for every dollar that a community is able to fund, EFC can actually give them $2 for clean water or $3 for a drinking water project. So we're able to actually give them more for their money than they would find if they went to a private bank or another organization for that funding. So all of those funding buckets go in to our program and they come out in the form of our low cost funding. We provide 0% interest loans to, subsidized rate loans, and even market rate, which is still a better rate than what many municipalities would find at any other private bank or other entity. And then we also are able to leverage the program, like I said, so that even communities that have active loans with us, market rate loans or subsidized loans, they're actually able to continue to get refinanced or lower rates, so that we're always trying to get the best rate for communities so that the projects can continue to be affordable. Involved in this, we have a number of other state grant programs that can be combined with this funding, so that we can ultimately try to fund as much of a project as possible so that communities can do as much as they can to help upgrade or improve their infrastructure systems. So now that I've kind of given you an overview of EFC, very high level, Liz, I'll turn it back to you to get into the specifics of our presentation.
All right, thank you. Yeah, so that's all to say. We do a lot of water and wastewater projects at EFC. It's been really interesting seeing statewide the different needs that different municipalities have. As you can imagine, the infrastructure needs for New York City versus Schenectady versus maybe a small rural village in upstate New York, all very different. But it all comes down to it's all connected for the water treatment cycle. So this figure is a little bit busy, but what I really wanted to drive home as we go through some of the basics for water and wastewater infrastructure is your drinking water source to treatment to water use to water wastewater creation and treatment. It's a big cycle, and we're going to kind of come back to this figure a little bit, but we're going to be starting here. We're going to talk a little bit about where your drinking water comes from, what the distribution system looks like, how is that water treated, and how, different aspects to the residential home. And then we will then talk a little bit about the back end, about developing wastewater. So I love this picture because it makes me think of middle school or high school, but in general, where does our water come from? So, you're going to have this standard water cycle where, it comes from rain, from snow, and eventually it will go into our surface waters and groundwater. Eventually you have runoff, evaporation, and it's just this constant cycle that will eventually add to the available water source that we have for municipal treatment systems. But for the most part, most of our water does come from rain and snowfall. So in general, drinking water source can either be from a surface water or a groundwater source. And, if you're going to be building a brand new treatment system, or you say that, you have new development in an area that doesn't have municipal water, and you need to find a water source for that area, you're going to be looking at your options and determining your best source. You're going to be looking at quality. You're going to be looking at quantity. Like if you're going to drill a well, is there going to be enough water to be able to provide those users that you need to serve from that well? The treatability of that water source, how you treat a surface water source versus groundwater is going to be very different. And of course, the New York State Department of Health regulates these public water systems and it does have specific requirements that have to be met to make sure that it's safe for the end user to drink. And of course, you can have different treatment systems for residential versus a municipal village or city, for example. What those requirements look like is going to be different, because of the quantity of water that you're creating. So I think, with the folks that are on this call and your interests, I'm sure this is probably pretty obvious, but when we talk about a surface water source of where your water could come from for a drinking water source, we're talking lakes, reservoirs, rivers, and streams. We're going to be using the term surface water on the wastewater side as well, of the final end discharge location of that treated effluent. But these are pretty common examples of where your drinking water could relatively come from, depending on where your municipality is located. And, if we're comparing groundwater to surface water, well, why would you choose one over the other? There's pros and cons to both. Drinking water has a lot of really good benefits. It's generally better water quality than a surface water source. It's more naturally protected because you have surface water that is going to be filtrated down, and you have really good water quality through that natural treatment. Less things can really impact that water quality. And if you're using it as a water source, it generally uses less treatment is required. So for a municipality, that means it's going to be less expensive to get out to the end user potentially, and you have more consistent water quality. And comparatively, surface water, you can get a lot more quantity than you can with groundwater. And groundwater can be difficult to find. I mean, I've worked on projects with municipalities where maybe they don't have a good surface water source available to them, like a lake or a river nearby, so they have to depend on drilling a well for groundwater. But it can be sometimes really difficult to find a well that produces enough water for the amount of users that you need. So that is something that always comes into play, and it could take years to find a suitable water source for a municipality or a municipality may have a well that operates just fine, but say they want to bring on more users to the system and provide more water to more residents, they have to find a new well or a backup well, and it can just be a little complicated. Surface water, like I said, you can usually better for larger systems because you can find more of it. But the problem is it's more vulnerable to contamination, more treatments required, which we'll kind of touch on later. And the water quality can be a little less consistent. Turbidity is kind of a big one, depending on, a river that, might be stirring up a lot of sediment, for example, may cause some more difficulty in treating later on. So, every municipality, whether you're talking about water treatment or wastewater treatment, they're going to be different based on the needs of the community and the water source. So this is a very generalized diagram, but I think gives a good example for what would go into treating a surface. In this case, this would be for surface water, and but high level. You may be adding some chemicals to the water that you're pulling off of a lake, for example. Coagulation is just used to help any sediments or particulates that are in your water to get really heavy so it drops out during your coagulation and flocculation process. You are trying to get all those to fall out so that during your final filtration process, you can remove those from the water and you have a nice clear drinking water to go out to the end users. Pretty much every drinking water source has to do disinfection. That's usually through chlorine or some other chemical. And that's going to be dosed appropriately to be able to make sure that the last user in your system is sufficiently protected from bacteria or viruses, and that the water is safe to drink. So, if you're unfortunate to have your house directly next to a treatment plant, if you ever feel like, oh, my water kind of tastes a little chlorine-y, that could be why. Maybe it's you're in an unfortunate location. But I mean, that's um, part of every drinking water system that, that you're providing that level of treatment for your end users. So for the most part, most communities have some sort of water storage tank, which is the symbol in the middle, that kind of provides several purposes. Storage, of course, you are required to have a certain amount of available storage for the users in your system to use. And it also helps with pressure. So, Rotterdam, for example, has some really tall elevated storage tanks, and based on the um, uh, area, the hydraulics of their system, that elevated tank is required to provide pressure for your house to make sure that your shower on the second floor feels really good, or fire flow protection to make sure in the case of a fire there's enough pressure that water can be drawn off the system and be able to protect those users. So this diagram again just kind of puts in perspective some of the infrastructure that a water system might have. So as it leaves the water treatment plant in the bottom right, you may have some pumps to help get it into your system, into your storage tank that's at a higher elevation. And then you have transmission water mains or distribution mains that are getting the water throughout the village. And then you'll have service laterals that go to each of your houses, and hydrants, of course, for emergencies and other aspects of the system. And what I like to call out is, if you're not familiar, every community is required to put out an annual drinking water quality report. So if you're interested in, hey, I live in the town of Niskayuna, and I want to know more about where my water comes from and how is it treated, and how much water are we using, that is all available in those reports. For example, I pulled the city of Schenectady's here, and it goes into some information about how many people does the system serve, how much water is produced annually. In the city's case, the water comes from the Great Flats Aquifer via wells. This area is actually really unique. There are several aquifers throughout the state, but the Great Flats Aquifer is incredibly large and covers, Schenectady, Niskayuna, and a lot of the surrounding areas. So most of our water comes directly from wells, so we don't necessarily pull off of the Mohawk River, for example, and we have really, really great water quality. I even remember working for the town of Rotterdam on a project years ago, and they had won the New York State drinking water competition for taste. Their water had claimed the top prize, and they were very proud about that back in the day. So we do have good water coming from the aquifer. And so the report will also identify how is it treated. So Schenectady's water is chlorinated, fluoride is added, and organic phosphates as well. So just in general, like what I guess design-wise goes into developing a water treatment system. I've talked a few times about the system being sized for existing users. So, they're going to be factoring how many residential users, what commercial industry, commercial users or industry are in my area that need water, and how much water do they need. In general, 100 gallons per day per individual is the rule of thumb, and gets used to size how much water a system might use. And the system will also be designed to provide adequate pressures in the system. For example, there's going to be a minimum pressure required to use fire hydrants to make sure that you can address a fire if need be. And of course, there's a sweet spot to make sure that residential pressure in a home is is adequate. So that all goes into evaluating a system. Adequate chlorine levels, of course. You want to make sure that that water is drinkable. And of course, any DOH design standards that go into all of that. So I wanted to add a couple things of what you may encounter as a homeowner and how that relates to the drinking water system. So these next two slides kind of were a couple things that I thought of as I was preparing the presentation. So a boil water advisory. Occasionally we'll get those, especially in the winter, because that's when drinking water systems, especially ones as old as ours, they in cold weather, because of potential or the risk of freezing of a water main, and then you have a freeze thaw, breaks of water mains are more common. So whenever there's a water main break, the community has to put out a boil water notice, because the drinking water may have encountered microorganisms such as fecal contamination, and it compromises the water treatment that, you know, the chlorination and the other treatment that you've had at the treatment plant is trying to address. So as soon as you have a water main break, you don't know what the quality of that water is anymore. So the community will notify residents in that area with the boil water notice. And boiling water for 1 minute will kill the microorganisms. So that's the rule of thumb. So once the water main is fixed and they go through the proper testing of the water quality to make sure that everything is back up to standards, then residents will be notified that they can use the water again. Hydrant flushing is another thing that, you know, as a kid, I remember our DPW staff going out and flushing the hydrants, and I never really understood, but I always thought it was cool to see how much water could come out of a hydrant. And, you know, as I got into this field, I understood more what its purpose was. So, you know, hydrant flushing is something that's routinely scheduled by your municipality. I feel like often I see it done in the spring, maybe the fall, but it has a purpose. It's not just that the hydrants, sometimes you can have a leaky hydrant, but most of the time it is something that is done intentionally. And it ensures water quality in the system. So the purpose is you're removing that stagnant water in the system. You know, when you're designing water systems, the goal is to try to loop your system so you have fresh water constantly moving throughout the pipes. But, you know, the layout of your community, it might not be conducive to do that, or it just wasn't built that way back in the day. Now we know better. But flushing the system, if you have a dead end street, you know, it can help remove that water that maybe isn't getting like cycled out as often as that it should. It also helps the operators exercise the hydrants too. You know, I'm sure everyone thinks about the shut-off valves in their home. The less you operate them, the more likely you're not going to be able to open them when you need them. So by opening these hydrants and exercising the valves, it will keep everything loose and be able to be operable when the fire department needs to use the hydrant. So one of the reasons people don't like hydrant flushing, and even municipalities will be hesitant to do it, because they know residents really don't like when they notice discolored water. It gives you the impression that your water's not safe to drink. I'm here to tell you that it is. When you flush a hydrant, it sometimes stirs up natural mineral deposits in the water mains that just develop over time. So the discoloration has nothing to do with the water not being treated properly, but it's really just it's just like mixing up what's there, unfortunately. So there's no health hazard associated with it. There is like a common disclaimer, like run your water for a few minutes. Maybe try to avoid washing clothes because it could discolor or stain your clothes if you're using that water to do your laundry with, but it should dissipate after a short period of time. So on the private side, I don't know how many of you on the call maybe live outside of the city or town and you have a residential well or a private well. But again, if you're, I actually had a coworker that recently built a house, and she had to find hired someone to drill a new well, and kind of these common themes that we've been talking about finding sufficient capacity, and that was kind of tricky for her site. But again, and if you are on your own lot, making sure the well that you're going to build has sufficient capacity for your needs. It's imperative that you have proper separation distance away from your septic system to make sure that you don't have any cross-contamination. And I've actually never had a house with a well, but I know from some folks that I work with, some common treatment add-ons that you might see. Water softeners are pretty common to help with water hardness. Sometimes systems have reverse osmosis, which helps remove unwanted chemicals. I think that also helps a lot with the odor of some private wells, might have that like sulfury smell. So those are some things that you might be familiar with if you have a private well. I kind of one I never really think about is, it could be true on a municipal well, but especially on a private well, because it's a smaller quantity, is drought considerations. If you have a really dry well, a very dry summer, perhaps you might experience limitation on how much water you have to use in your well. So some things to consider, maybe water use restrictions. I know we hear about that a lot out west, but definitely something to consider here, as we go through with these warmer summers. And homeowners, of course, should test their well water periodically just to make sure there aren't any issues. Okay, so that is a very broad view of drinking water. So again, we're kind of coming back to this cycle here, and now we're gonna kind of dovetail to wastewater. So, you're using up all of your water from your municipal system, and where does that go? What does it look like on the back end? Okay, so first off, what is considered wastewater? Well, I don't know. So it's going to include water that has constituents of human or animal waste. Think about, we use the toilet, that's wastewater in a nutshell. It could include water that has residuals from cooking, cleaning, or bathing. So basically any water you're using for your day-to-day life would be considered wastewater. And of course, industrial waste. There's other things too, but in general, we're going to be talking about domestic wastewater today, just what comes from the home, and not really focus on too much of the industrial, the commercial side, but it's all included in terms of what the municipal treatment plant would have to treat for. And the final effluent discharge, or once the water is treated from a treatment plant, what we call effluent, that can be discharged to groundwater or surface water, sort of the reverse of what we just talked about for drinking water. Surface water is the most common, but we definitely have systems throughout the state that discharge the groundwater. And these facilities are permitted by the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. So the goal for these permits of the treatment plants are to protect the receiving water body. So wherever you're discharging to is what the treatment limits are going to be protective of. So it looks a little similar to the water treatment plant that we talked about a while ago. Wastewater is more complicated in terms of the biology that goes into the treatment process. In the consulting world, I feel like we used to talk about how drinking water is easy to design, and wastewater is more complicated. Mostly because when you're talking about the biological process of treating for the we call them bugs, but like for the different solids materials that come into the treatment plant, there's a lot of chemistry and biology that go into treating for the levels of, say, phosphorus and nitrogen in those constituents, and providing a clean enough effluent to go out to a waterway. So for wastewater treatment plants, we have what we call headworks, which is our #1 for the bar screening, where you're going to be removing any like physical material from the wastewater stream. Grit removal, so trying to, again, settle out as much material as you can and get that away from your treatment processes downstream. This is what's considered kind of a standard wastewater treatment plant process showing clarification, aeration, followed by secondary clarification. There's a lot more advanced treatment systems these days that kind of like bundle these all together in some pretty cool treatment processes. But for the most part, this is kind of the standard example. So the clarification is kind of similar to the sedimentation process in a water treatment plant where you're trying to settle out the sludge or the heavier materials in a wastewater stream and have that cleaner effluent kind of go through the rest of the treatment process. So you do have a form of chlorination or disinfection. It doesn't have to be chlorination. Ultraviolet or UV treatment is pretty common these days, but some form of disinfection. Some treatment plants, depending on the water body, may have something a little bit more robust than this for nutrient removal, but for most part, this is pretty common for a lot of treatment plants in New York State. Okay, so sanitary sewers and storm sewers. So similar to drinking water collection distribution lines, there's a lot of utilities in your street. You have gas, you have water, you have sewer, and you have storm. So this diagram just kind of explains a lot of this is probably the most typical for municipalities that they have separate storm and sanitary sewer systems. So the sanitary sewer is going to take all your wastewater that's going to come from your residential home. You know, you're going to have your toilet that's connected to a sewer lateral, which is then connected to the sewer main that takes it to the treatment plant. Conversely, not all municipalities have a storm system, but if you do, like in my neighborhood, I have these storm drains on the side of my street that take any storm water runoff from the road and brings it to a catch basin. There's a centralized pipe that eventually takes it to some discharge location. So the key is you're trying to keep your storm runoff away from your sanitary sewer so you're not inundating the treatment plant with more flow than it's really designed to treat for. There are some municipalities, usually older and larger cities, that have combined sewer systems. City of Albany has one. Syracuse, Buffalo are other examples of municipalities that have combined systems. These municipalities are doing a lot of expensive infrastructure projects to separate their sewer so that you would have a separate storm and sanitary sewer. But how a combined system works is that all of your storm and your wastewater are collected in one universal pipe. And then normally the waste would all be taken to a wastewater treatment plant for treatment. But in times of high rain events, the combined wastewater would overflow a weir structure and it would go untreated to your waterway. So as you can imagine, it's not ideal. You don't want to send untreated waste to your waterway. In some cases, it's diluted. It's not like you're sending a pure strength wastewater to the waterways, but it's definitely not the way you would design systems now. And there's a lot of enforcement actions by DEC mandating that communities that have excess combined sewer overflows, or CSOs, that is what we call them, trying to reduce those because it does pollute the waterway and can cause some problems for fish and wildlife and things like that. But yeah, it's mostly common in larger urban municipalities and something that they're trying to alleviate going forward. But you know, infrastructure is expensive. It's going to take a long time to separate the systems. Okay, so we talked about trying to keep stormwater out of the sanitary sewer, and even if you have a separated system, it's just naturally going to happen over time. So this diagram just kind of talks a little bit about sewer inflow and infiltration, which is a huge problem for municipalities, especially ones like Schenectady and Niskuna, that the systems are old. The material that was used to build sewer mains back in the day, usually vitrified clay, and those clay pipes have a lot of cracks and breaks. And how you would build a sewer system now is you would use PVC or HDPE, and it's less, just over time, it's not going to be as vulnerable as clay will. So this just shows that there's going to be locations where groundwater, for example, can get into your sanitary sewer through um, broken sewer laterals. If your house is anything like mine, I have an old sewer lateral that I get root intrusions from my tree, and if I'm not careful, I have to snake my line, and it's just kind of a pain. But the reason why you don't want stormwater, you don't want stormwater into your sanitary sewer is that it's inundating the treatment plant that wasn't originally designed to treat that flow, and it's really just really expensive to treat that much water if you don't have to. So really just trying to come up with ways to rehabilitate the sewer and avoid those connections. From a homeowner's perspective, the best thing I can say is make sure your sump pump or your roof drain is not connected to the sewer. Most municipalities have a sewer use ordinance that doesn't allow it anyways, but these are really easy things that can be done to help your municipality properly treat their system, is to make sure that's going out in your backyard or somewhere else. Okay, so again, some things to consider here. Sorry, I'm losing my voice a little bit. Okay, so again, similar size, about 100 gallons per day per individual. The treatment level is going to be dependent on the receiving water body. So say you have a treatment plant that's discharging to a trout spawning stream or a large lake, your treatment levels are going to be different. And you might also have different watershed priorities. So phosphorus reduction, for example, in the Chesapeake watershed might be different than somewhere else. But the goal for DEC, especially who has the permits, is to eliminate pollution to maintain the highest water quality, to help protect public health, recreation, and fish and wildlife. So, if you're discharging a wastewater effluent to a water body that has a lot of fish or other animals, you want to make sure there's enough oxygen content for them. You're not making the water warmer than it should be. There's a lot of things that come into play with discharging a treatment plant. And I wanted to throw this in here. Again, I've been using myself as an example for a lot of things, but if you're thinking about, do I have to replace my sewer lateral, or I have a problem with my water service that goes to the house, whose responsibility is it to fix it? And that's kind of tricky because it's going to depend on your municipality and what the rules are. But generally speaking, the homeowner is responsible for the sewer lateral and the water service line on their property up to the point it connects to the municipality's water line or sewer main in the street. So just something to keep in mind. So you're not like me calling the municipality to ask them to fix something and have them find out, oh yeah, sorry, I guess it's my responsibility. But every community is a little bit different with how they own and maintain the infrastructure. So it's good to understand what's in play for your house. Okay, so we talked about municipal wastewater treatment. You could have your own system. You could have a septic tank. So this kind of has a couple graphics to show what that looks like. But for a septic system, you're going to have some form of a tank that, again, kind of mirrors kind of what we talked about for the wastewater side of municipal treatment. You're trying to have the heavier material settle out. It's going to flow over that baffle wall and then go out to some form of a drain field or a leach field on your property and eventually flow down into groundwater. So I can't stress enough, if you have a septic tank, just make sure you're thinking about routine maintenance to get the most out of your system. That usually means like having someone come pump out the material every 3 to 5 years, for example. Be careful what you flush. Septic tanks are very susceptible to fats, oil, greases. You really don't want anything that's gonna just fall out, like only flush toilet paper. If you flush any heavier materials, it's just going to sit in your tank and cause you problems. Even those flushable wipes, they're not flushable. They get caught up on stuff and cause a lot of problems. And gar garbage disposals are not great either. Okay, I'm gonna pass it over to Máire and grab some water. I'll be right back.
All right, thanks, Liz. So we wanted to talk a little bit about what the infrastructure needs are in New York State, since Liz has kind of gone through what the systems look like. What does that mean for New York State? So obviously, as I think we all would agree, water and wastewater infrastructure is a necessity. So we all need it. We need to drink clean water. We need to be able to flush our toilets, take showers, wash our dishes, all the things that we would consider basic necessities now. But infrastructure is aging and does require replacement, especially in a state like New York. It's an older state. A lot of our infrastructure was built, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, and has needed continued maintenance and updating over time. And obviously now we have increased treatment standards than what we may have had 20 years ago, 50 years ago, and so on. So the cost of those projects continues to rise. So what do we do about it? So one of the biggest things that we do, it's done at a federal level. The EPA does what's called need surveys. And so that's on both the drinking water and clean water or sewer side, which we do it every few years. And it's used to determine what the financial needs are in every state, so that the federal government, when they're looking at the allotments for the state revolving fund, can kind of take that into consideration. So for New York State, the last drinking water needs survey was conducted in 2021, and New York State reported $35.1 billion in need. And this survey is from the year the survey is conducted over the next 20 years. So it's kind of like a forward-looking assessment, so we know, what might be coming down the pike. And for the clean water side, the last need survey was held in 2022, and New York State reported over $53 billion in need on the sewer side. So for an organization like EFC, this gives us really good insight into what we're looking at in the future. I mean, I think it's obvious. We always know that we're going to need to fund infrastructure. We know that's never going away, but it's helpful to know what the scale is, so that when we are, allocating our funds, or when we're trying to be proactive about our fund management, we're making sure that we are able to try our utmost to meet these needs. Obviously, our programs are oversubscribed. There's no way that we would be able to, immediately fund $53.9 billion in need. But, we try to do as much as we can. In the last year, we were able to fund $3.4 billion in infrastructure projects. We were able to give that out in the form of our financing and grant. So, it's small in comparison to $54 billion, but it's a lot when it comes to size and scale of infrastructure projects that are starting or are in the process of being upgraded. So what does a project look like? So I'm sure a lot of you have, driven past or walked past infrastructure projects for sewer drinking water systems in your lives, and you've kind of wondered, what's going on. So we thought we'd give you a little bit of an overview of what the project planning looks like for an infrastructure project. So when municipalities are thinking about starting an infrastructure project, whether that's a drinking water or sewer project, they obviously want to identify the project. So that's the first step. A lot of municipalities will kind of go through, what are their priorities? What are the areas of the system that have needed upgrades for years? In some cases, they haven't been upgraded in decades. So they might identify that as a priority project for them to look at. And then the next step would be to assemble a project team. So there's a lot of people that are involved in these infrastructure projects at the municipal level alone. And then you got everybody else involved, like EFC and DOH, DEC, But at the municipal level, a project team would consist of obviously the municipal staff, so all of those people that will work on these projects day to day. Most municipalities will have an engineer, either an in-house engineer or a consulting engineer that will help them design the project and come up with the best path forward for the project, the most affordable and the best use of resources for whatever project has been identified. There's usually a fiscal advisor who helps manage the funding for the project and make sure that, you know, they're applying for the right funding, that they are able to, you know, get funding in-house so they can pay for contractors and all of the staff that are involved, all of the tools and equipment that is needed. And then there's local council as well. So for these larger infrastructure projects, a lot of communities will need to have, you know, do a bond resolution, which basically says that they will borrow for the funding that is necessary because these are multi-million-dollar projects. So the local council helps with those legal aspects of it. It may also include environmental reviews to make sure that there's no disruption to the environment and things like that. So then there's project development. So that can include a couple of different things. So during project development, municipalities will evaluate what options are available to solve whatever problem they've identified as the reason they want to conduct the project. So this is where the engineer will come in and be helpful. They do an alternatives analysis to just compare the different options and identify which one is the best and the most affordable for the community. They'll do preliminary field work to, you know, examine whatever the area might be for drinking water, you know, if they're trying to look for a water source, or on the sewer side, if they're, you know, trying to fix certain areas of the system, they'll do that field work. And some of the most important pieces that they'll do is public outreach and coordination with the regulatory agencies. So it's kind of a two-pronged approach. Obviously, they need to communicate to residents, homeowners, people who live in the community about what's going to happen, what project they're doing, why they're doing it, why it's important, and how much it will cost, you know, what the impacts might be for those costs. And then coordinating with the regulatory agencies is important so that we know at the state level what's going on. So a lot of projects include, you know, needing permits for EFC. You know, while we're not a regulator, we get involved with the funding. So a lot of communities will come to us to ask us about what funding packages are available. But having that coordination so that the regulatory agencies and the funding agencies are involved as early as possible so that they know what's available or what's needed helps the project progress as easily as possible. Once they've done all of that, the next step is to secure funding. So this is where they might look at their capital budget to see if you know, the community can afford part of the project. Can they fund it themselves? Or are they going to need to access grants and loans or financing? So that's where we come in as EFC. A lot of municipalities, I would say probably 99% of them, cannot fund these projects on their own. So we step in to provide a lot of the funding for these projects and offset as much of the cost as possible through grants, through our low interest financing programs. And also there are other agencies that provide funding as well. So EFC might be involved in a project that might have, you know, 2 or 3 or 4 other funding entities because communities are trying to fund as much of their project as possible to make it the most affordable for their residents. So we work very closely with our co-funding partners at other agencies to make sure we're all on the same page and that we're, you know, putting our best foot forward so that we're helping the community with their projects. And then ideally, a community has been able to get all of the grants and low interest financing that they need. They're able to fund the project. And the next step is to build the project. And that's what a lot of you have probably seen, which is this last picture here of them just in progress of building those projects. But all of the other steps happen before they can even get to that point of building the project. So there's a lot that goes into these infrastructure projects, and this is why they take years to complete. So there's just a lot that goes in on the front end and the back end for these projects to be successful. And so just to talk a little bit about some project planning. So what are the things that are needed for a project to be successful? You initially need an engineering report. So that's developed to evaluate the options and determine the best project to solve the problem identified. Liz and I are both having trouble with our voices tonight.
Yeah.
So next step is the environmental review. That's kind of what I talked about earlier. You want to evaluate the impacts of the project so that you're making sure you're recommending any mitigation measures if needed, and that the project is not going to disrupt the environment in any significant way. You know, I think a lot of us want to make sure that our infrastructure is updated and is working appropriately, but we also don't want to harm the environment. We want to protect it and try to conserve it as much as possible. So that's a key component of these projects, is making sure we're not being harmful to the environment when we're doing these infrastructure upgrades or building these new systems. You
Maire.
then would need to look at a bond resolution. So this allows the community to borrow for funding for these very large scale projects, but it also notifies the public about how much the project is going to cost. You know, what does that mean for every ratepayer, homeowner, resident of the area? And that needs to get approved by the community before the project can move forward. So for EFC, a bond resolution, an approved bond resolution, is required before we can even provide any kind of funding or even evaluate it for approval for funding. So it's a really important component of the process. And then you look at different funding options to try to make it as affordable as possible. So we will provide a lot of insight and guidance to communities for their projects to make sure that we're trying to fill the gaps as much as possible. So obviously a lot of communities would like grant. We would love to give as much grant as we possibly can. We're always oversubscribed in our grant programs. But what's nice for EFC is we have this financing component through the revolving fund. So we're able to pair those together to try to fully fund these projects in the most affordable way. And then you have final design, which the selected project is fully completed. You know, it's been assessed, they picked their alternative, they know what they're going to do, and the engineer, the consultant, or the in-house engineer for certain municipalities will start the project. So that's what they put together. They know how much it's going to cost. They know what they need to do, and they're ready to move forward. So once they're ready to move forward, they have that final design. That's when they get to the permits. So that's where the regulatory agencies come in. So they identify the types of permits that are needed during the environmental review and during the design phase so that they can get those secured before they start actually constructing the project. So those are kind of all of the pieces that need to be pulled together before a project can even get started.
All right. Well, I know we went a little long, but I want to say thank you to everyone. This is a great opportunity to kind of show everyone a little bit of our world, both at EFC, and it's not often that people ask to hear about water, wastewater. So it was a fun opportunity to give some background, and would love to help answer any questions that we have. And I think I'll stop sharing my screen.
That's great. And if everybody just wants to unmute themselves as they ask questions, while people are thinking about their questions, I'm gonna get my quick one in. On the personal level, you said that make sure your sump pump isn't connected to the sewer.
Right.
To me, in my 1950s house, everything under that ground is one huge mystery. And I was even trying to get the town of Niskayuna, which you would think a town like Niskayuna would have everything on AutoCAD or something, and it
You
sure
would be
isn't.
you would be surprised how few municipalities actually have their infrastructure mapped. It costs money, and like Niskayuna too. A lot of like I live on Grand Boulevard in Old Niskayuna. Like the system's just really old. A lot of these houses are packed together. What they allowed when they built the houses is very different than what they want residents to do now. So it is a
So,
little bit of an uphill battle to,
so
get.
what I found with Niskuna and trying to figure out where there's no directionality to seeing where my sewer pipe, and I bring this up because it probably applies to a whole lot of people too. There's no directionality with when it goes, where it goes down into the garage, with which direction it even goes. I have no
Yeah,
idea.
yeah.
As far as like finding out how,
Yeah, so if you were to contact Niskuna, like, well, I did this recently because my curb stop valve, so I couldn't find the shut off valve to my water line in front of my house. And I contacted the town of Niskuna. They didn't have records, but what they did is they brought a metal detector out and they were able to locate it that way. Um, my neighbor at the
Yeah,
time worked for the water department, so he was able to do that real easily. So,
yeah, they
that
charge you. You charge you $50, I think,
yeah.
Colin, when I did it.
well,
Yeah,
It took them I had three big holes in my yard.
yeah. So it can be
But they found
tricky.
it.
I mean, you can kind of estimate it, like if you know where your water and sewer comes into your basement. Not every house has a sump pump, but mine has a sump pump area, and that's right where my sewer lateral and water line comes in. So I kind of knew, like, okay, I knew what side of my house it was on, and I know it went out to the front of the house to the road, because it does have to flow by gravity the sewer lateral at least has to flow by gravity in most cases to get to the line. So if you kind of know where to start, a local municipality may be able to help you, but it's going to depend on their records, like you mentioned.
okay, yeah. I mean, he talked to me in a very friendly way about how they could put dye in it that we would flush and see, and that was the last I ever heard of him until I read that he left the job. So,
Mhm.
um,
Yeah, that's frustrating.
anyway, that's where I am with it. But any other questions for Liz and Mayor?
Yeah, you've heard a lot about the wastewater treatment plant here in Muskegon expansion. Was that funded through an organization similar to yours?
Yeah, it
You know?
actually wasn't. I'm familiar a little bit with that upgrade because my former company worked on it, but it was after I left. The town of Niskuna actually hasn't used their funding historically, mostly because our better financing options are in place for municipalities that have a lower median household income. So the town of Niskuna historically hasn't scored well enough on our intended use plan to get like the best financing packages. So I think the town has chosen to fund it themselves. Town of Colony is very similar. They have a very proactive water and sewer program. So they have the ability to find, they get pretty good rates themselves. They don't necessarily have to go through us. I suspect Niskuna is probably pretty similar. That if they went to a bank or went out to get a loan themselves, they would do maybe not as good as us, but good enough that you can kind of avoid some of the extra stuff that comes with involving another agency to get funding. Yeah.
We used to hear a lot about, I mean, maybe some people still do hear a lot about using effluent or sewage on agricultural fields,
Yeah,
but
we call
there's
that water reuse. It has to be treated, so you could actually do that both on I've seen some municipalities use their wastewater effluent for like irrigation on golf courses or other locations. They have to do some extra like side stream treatments and kind of have a use for it to make it worthwhile for them to do it, but definitely happens. And I've
can,
also go ahead.
can they ever take care of the accumulation of heavy metals from that, or is that always going to be
Oh.
an issue?
Um, I don't know the answer to that. I know some municipalities will even have sophisticated ways so we talked more about the effluent side and not so much the solid side of like, what do you do with that solid material, waste, your physical waste that you're taking from your wastewater system. You can landfill it, which is pretty common, but some communities will treat it to such a level they can actually land apply it, or they can compost it and it will sell back they'll be able to give it to the residents to be able to use. I actually just went on a site visit to the town of Shenango out near Binghamton, and they have a pretty robust composting facility. And that treatment process and a couple others will it will kill off enough of the vectors and things like that in the waste that you can actually land apply it and use it for composting. So for them, it, they've they have people coming up to their treatment plant nonstop to try to get the compost to be able to use it. They just give it away, because they don't have to pay to, to get rid of it and landfill it.
And things that we always hear about as being kind of persistent, like antibiotics and so forth, are pretty well taken care of in those cases.
Yeah, like there's things like that. Like you discourage people from flushing down the toilet. You want to try to limit anything that really shouldn't be in the waste stream that should be treated properly. But yeah, I mean, a lot of that is going to be handled. It's going to be diluted probably enough on the municipal side. It's a lot of domestic waste is not a high strength waste. But say you had a industry that makes chemicals, for example, and they have like a pretty strong waste. You might even have a pre-treatment facility with a sophisticated treatment process before it even gets to your municipal treatment plant. So a lot of that is taken out before it, goes through the regular process.
Okay. You mentioned the seed money from EPA as a federal agency. Is that looking pretty safe at this point?
Yes, yep, it is. So how it works is we're able to apply for funding for the upcoming federal fiscal year in advance. So EFC and the state revolving funds, we're lucky we didn't have major impacts due to, the current situation. So we had all of our funding secured and in-house, and again, because the mandate is these programs just have to run in perpetuity in the event that there is no funding, we would still be able to fund all of the projects that were on our intended use plan. New York, it's going to sound like I'm bragging, but this is true. We do have the best SRF program, the largest SRF program, and that's because we have such a substantial leveraging component of our program. Not all states do the leveraging. Some of them just aren't big enough to do it, and others just they haven't structured their program that way. But because we leverage, we are able to pull in funding so that we can just constantly keep putting funds back into the queue for other projects. So we're actually able to fund a substantial amount more than what we actually receive from the federal government because of that leveraging. So luckily, New York is really good at managing our program financially. And so we were in good shape. So we were business as usual, which was a relief to all of us for sure.
And municipalities for sure.
Yes, yeah, definitely.
You can brag. That sounds good.
Yeah. Our vice president says we are the largest water infrastructure bank in the universe.
Really?
So, and he's
that's
not wrong.
off of Earth.
Technically not wrong. So until we find another one out there on another planet somewhere.
Some other questions, comments? I have one last quick one that I was thinking about with Helene in North Carolina. Of all the million problems and suffering there, one of the biggest was that all of their water treatment plants, sewage was flooded, under 10 feet of water in Asheville. And by definition, I mean, if you're using surface water, your treatment plants are going to be at a low level, probably next to it.
I had considered putting this in the treatment in the presentation because it's such a big one. And you're right, especially wastewater treatment plants, you want them in the lowest spot possible because you want to try to avoid pumping at all costs because it's expensive. So if you can flow by gravity to get there, that's the goal. But I don't know if anybody is from the Southern Tier and remembers the Binghamton area getting flooded during Irene and Lee. That was actually one of the first projects I worked on when I came to EFC. They built a huge flood wall along the Susquehanna River to protect their plant because their plant got flooded in 2 back-to-back storms, like within a couple years, and they the aerial photos were unreal of this plant being completely underwater, and a lot of facilities have been affected. So resiliency is a big thing, and part of what we include in any of our reviews that we design before when we don't design them, but when we approve designs for projects that we fund, resiliency is a big part. You know, do you have an opportunity to raise equipment if you're in a flood zone? If you can't, can you relocate your facility? What are other ways you can protect the infrastructure? Because, you know, you don't want to be in a position where you can't provide that service for the municipality, of course. You're not protecting the water body that the treatment plant is designed for. And also you want to protect your investment. If you're spending $5 million to upgrade your facility, you don't want that to all be wasted 5 years later and your plant gets flooded. So, but it's expensive, of course. And for municipalities on the Hudson River or in, say, Long Island Sound or by the coast, there's even further protections that have to be looked at for future sea level rise and things like that. So it's going to get really, really expensive to do infrastructure projects down on Long Island in New York City. They already are, and now, you know, they have to be so much more protected from flooding. Yep.
Any other questions? Well, Liz, this was just,
Oh,
go
no,
ahead,
Janet. Looks like Janet has one.
Yeah.
I was just wondering, do you have a rough estimate of how much of the expense do the local communities pay for their operation and infrastructure? And how much is supplied by organizations like the EFC?
Oh, I don't know, Mayor, is that?
So like half and half maybe, or 75, 5?
So I don't have an estimate off the top of my head, but I would say that depending on the type of financing that a community can receive, you know, it's probably for sure it might be like a 50% to 60% split. I'm not sure about drinking water, but a lot of our communities will pair our financing with grants. So once you add that grant component in, you know, for example, our water infrastructure improvement grant program, which is our most popular one, that on the sewer side can fund up to 25% of a project, and on the drinking water side can fund up to 70%, and then the rest of the gap can be filled with our financing. So if there's grants, there's a portion, a pretty substantial portion that can be offset, that the community municipality wouldn't have to worry about paying for. So it's different for every project. That is an interesting question, though. I'm kind of interested in what the answer is. So you gave me some homework, but some fun homework, because I'm really interested in this. So
yeah, and we definitely find a lot of municipalities that they'll put, I mean, unless they like really, really, really have to do it, like it's an emergency or the state's mandating they have to do it. A lot of municipalities these days, I don't blame them, but they're waiting for grants to come.
Yep.
Projects are expensive, so maybe the project will get delayed a few years. Maybe they didn't get awarded a grant in this year's round, so they're going to put their project on pause and do it next year. So kind of depends, you know, how proactive the municipality is and what, you know, what's available to them. And it makes sense. They have to sell it to the public, especially if it's something that's like, we want to do this, we don't need to do it. And, you know, they're looking at the annual cost that each resident needs to pay, which is going to be your annual operation and maintenance of the system on top of whatever capital work you do. And we know that those rates never go down, they always go up. So, you know, that's a lot of municipal officials are taking a look at that and, you know, making decisions on what they move forward with or not. Yep.
Any others? Well, that was just great. It was just a perfect overview, and really appreciate you doing that for us.
All right, anytime. And if you guys ever want to learn about green infrastructure, we could do that too. So
Keep that in mind. Okay.
Yeah, for sure.
So I'll just say real quick that in December, we won't have our monthly speaker. We will have instead our our annual regifting party where you find that gift in your closet and re-gift it, and the proceeds go to Ecos. That'll be at our senior center, so check out our website for details on that. It's always fun. In January, when it's really cold and snowy up here, this will be nice. We're going to have our Zoom speaker talking to us from Austin, Texas, about native plants and how he started growing them in his neighborhood and got all the neighbors involved and the homeowners association. And so that should be a nice one for when it's cold up here in January. That'll be January 15th. All right. Well, thank you so much again, both of you, Máire and Liz.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us.
It will
Great
be
talking with everybody
posted.
today.
Tell anybody else about it on our website.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you all. Have a good night.
Yeah,
Thank
bye
you.
everyone.
Have a good night.